So hi Danny, how does Ratpack handle asynchronous requests differently than other frameworks?
So Ratpack is different from other asynchronous frameworks in that other asynchronous web frameworks, you tend to just fire and forget. So you fire off an asynchronous action and it's up to the user to figure out when it comes back and how to deal with that. That's not the case in Ratpack. If you would like the asynchronous action to come back and eventually tie back into request processing, Ratpack has to know about it, which means that Ratpack manages the knowledge about asynchronous operations. So when you create promises, by default, Ratpack keeps track of them and they serialize them. And therefore, Ratpack keeps track of each asynchronous execution, and therefore you're able to get good error handling and you're able to do transformations and everything like that. And by the time you're ready, Ratpack understands how many asynchronous operations that you've had, and if there are any left over, Ratpack will take care and make sure that they all get executed. If you don't, then Ratpack understands that you forgot to handle some kind of asynchronous request and can terminate a connection to the client immediately. This is not the case in something like Node.js as an example, where you fire off an asynchronous operation, and if you forget to handle it, then the client ends up hanging on the request. So Ratpack serializes asynchronous operations by default and is able to detect whenever a user hasn't, or rather when the developer has not dealt with subscribing to the end of that promise. So here's a question for Marcin. Marcin, what are some best practices around using Jeb?
Okay, so best practices when using Jeb, there's quite a lot of them, but let's concentrate on best practices for when using Jeb for testing asynchronous JavaScript applications. So, for example, applications, single-page applications, basically. So a good practice is to hide all of the wait for calls when testing such applications in your modules and pages, and not use any wait fors in your tests. This is because it makes your tests look as if they were synchronous, and it also means that your tests will be less flaky, more reliable, and the whole asynchronicity will be hidden away from the test. And the question for Kevin, can you please explain if it's possible to automate integration tests that depend on external services, like, for example, databases, without the need to pre-install these external services on developer's machine?
Yeah, that's actually is possible nowadays using, for example, container technologies such as Docker. And if you are writing your tests inside the Java world on a JVM language or whatever, you can even use a tool like Test Containers, which is a very convenient library to use Docker containers for your integration tests. Yeah, Alberto, what are best practices and patterns for testing your Grails application?
Hello. To use a test, we have to. The first thing that you have to do is to test your application. You have to test. Start with the things like domain classes or only a service or a class, but you have to test all your code. Don't worry about to test an entire application if you have never done a test, but you have to test it. Come on. And I have a question to Kemil. Kemil, if you have to explain to my grandma what's a DSL, how can you do that?
Okay, so the question was what a DSL is and how would I explain it to my grandma. So DSL is a domain-specific language, a language that uses the same language, the same vocabulary in code as we use when defining the requirements for the problem at hand, when expressing what this piece of code should be doing. So it's a way of expressing yourself in a language of the domain, the language of the problem at hand, in a way that is really expressive and really readable. That would be my answer to the question that I was given. Okay, so my question to Jack would be, what would be his approach to running a service in a cloud and doing it in a cost-effective way, given that we might only need to use this service once in a while, like, for example, a config server that we usually use only when booting up new services. So this is the question.
So why would we use the Lambda service or serverless computing in the case of a config server? We only need the config server whenever the apps are starting up, and as soon as we've delivered the configuration, today the config server runs 24/7 and basically does nothing for us. So with serverless computing, we'll be able to launch the config server on the fly, deliver the configuration, and shut it down and reduce the resource limitations. Now I have a question for Jen. Jen, if I'm already working in a Spring shop, it seems like we would want to automatically use Spring REST docs, but is there a reason we might want to consider using the Swagger API instead? Thanks.
Thanks. That's actually a really great question. So if you're already a Spring shop and you are looking at a documentation solution, you may also use Swagger for other things as well. So Swagger is not just about documentation, it's about creating an API specification to describe an API in general. And by having a standardized specification like Swagger defines, you can plug and play that with a lot of other modules, like creating client libraries.